welcome to the student faculty seminar of the Presidential Lecture Series and the Philosophy Course. It's a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon George Scialabba. He is a widely published, recognized, and influential author, essayist, reviewer, and blogger, and evidently a most beloved citizen of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this evening in the Denison Theater at 8 o'clock, he will talk about slouching towards utopia. And you will then get a full account of his background and accomplishments. His topic this afternoon is last men and women. Please join me in welcoming George Scialabba.
Thank you, Professor Borgman, and thank you all for coming. Can everyone hear me well enough? Good.
It'll be good for you to speak up as much as possible.
Okay, I'll try. Rightly or wrongly, I saw this afternoon's seminar as an opportunity to do something very different from tonight's lecture. An hour-long public lecture is necessarily a somewhat solemn official occasion. My lecture, accordingly, will be rather confident and upbeat, pitched to the general listener, expressing, with due qualifications, my convictions and hopes. This afternoon, with a smaller, mostly faculty audience, and more time for discussion, I intend to vent some uncertainties and misgivings. This evening, I will try to carry my audience with me at least a modest distance toward a shared utopian vision. This afternoon, I simply want to voice some troubling preoccupations and hear what you think in reply. We all know Nietzsche's parable of the last man. Certain that democracy, science, and secular humanism would definitively reshape civilization, Nietzsche, or more precisely Zarathustra, asked what kind of human being would result. His answer, dripping with sarcasm and contempt, was that ordinary humans would become a kind of insect, a race as ineradicable as the flea beetle, a creature that would make the earth itself small. Here is Zarathustra's lament. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? The last man asks, and he blinks. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One loves one's neighbor and rubs up against him, for one needs warmth. No shepherd and one herd. Everyone wants the same. Everyone is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. One has one's little pleasures for the day and one's little pleasures for the night, but one has a regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. Plenty of others, besides Nietzsche, have expressed misgivings about the likely character structure of democratic citizens. And these critics have not all been opponents of democracy. By the way, I'm using democracy in this talk to mean the whole Enlightenment program, not just political equality, but also feminism, pacifism, human rights, and the welfare state, along with a chastened belief in and modest hopes for moral and material progress. Tocqueville's reservations are well known. The general character of past society was diversity, he wrote. Unity and uniformity were nowhere to be met with. In modern society, however, all things threaten to become so much alike that the peculiar characteristics of each individual will be entirely lost in the uniformity of the general aspect. Even John Stuart Mill fretted that, quote, the general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power among mankind. At present, individuals are lost in the crowd, close quote. Criticisms of mass society and mass man swelled to a roar in the 20th century. Durkheim, Spengler, Schmidt, Ortega, Walter Lippmann, Heidegger, the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Alasdair MacIntyre, Alan Bloom, and many, many others. Most of these criticisms I reject, not for their often powerful diagnoses, but for the illiberal prescriptions that usually accompany them. I agree with Richard Rorty's admirably forthright solution to the supposed dilemma of democratic mediocrity. To wit, quoting, even if the typical character types of liberal democracies are bland, calculating, petty, and unheroic, the prevalence of such people may be a reasonable price to pay for political freedom. We can and should separate the private from the public, self-creation from tolerance, the pursuit of perfection from democratic politics. As Rorty famously elaborated, quoting him again, from Plato through Kant down to Habermas and Derrida, most philosophers have tried to fuse sublimity and decency, to fuse social hope with knowledge of something big. My own hunch is that we have to separate individual and social reassurance, to make sublimity, unlike tolerance, a private, optional matter. That means conceding to Nietzsche that democratic societies have no higher aim than what he called the last men, the people who have their little pleasures for the day and their little pleasures for the night. Maybe we should just make that concession, and also concede that democratic societies do not embody anything larger than themselves. Such societies should not aim at the creation of a new breed of human being, or at anything less banal than evening out people's chances of getting a little pleasure out of their lives. This means that citizens of those societies who have a taste for sublimity will have to pursue it in their own time and within the limits set by on liberty. But such opportunities might be quite enough. That, broadly, is where I also stand. With the Enlightenment and its contemporary heirs, and against Straussians, religious conservatives, national greatness neoconservatives, Ayn Randian libertarians, and anyone else for whom tolerance, civic equality, international law, and a universal minimum standard of material welfare are less than fundamental commitments. But now, having established my liberal democratic bona fides, and without, I hope, contradicting myself, I'd like to work the other side of the street for a while, to acknowledge the force of at least some criticisms of modernity and progress, leaving aside, perhaps for our subsequent discussion, the question of how we feminists, pacifists, egalitarians, and other secular liberals ought to take account of these criticisms in practice. Perhaps the most important, though also the most fragile, success of Enlightenment liberalism is the delegitimation, however partial, of war. The perception that the arbitrary power of absolute rulers facilitated needless and vastly destructive wars was a powerful impetus to popular sovereignty in the 19th and 20th centuries, culminating in the United Nations Charter. Though the Charter has been repeatedly violated by the great powers, and not only by them, it is not quite a dead letter, and a global culture of respect for international law is probably the most urgent cause any activist could devote her life to. Even so, biology has its rights. In 1910, the last year of his life, and only a few years before the First World War ended the long European peace, William James wrote a pamphlet for the Association for International Conciliation, one of many pacifist groups whose prominence in that period convinced many people that war between nations, being so obviously irrational, was therefore impossible. James's essay, entitled The Moral Equivalent of War, is a work of supreme pathos and wisdom. He himself was a pacifist, a founding member of the Anti-Imperialist League, a group formed to protest America's military interventions in Cuba, Haiti, and the Philippines, and one of the most humane and generous spirits America has ever produced. James understood perfectly the folly, the monstrosity, as he called it, of war, even in those comparatively innocent pre-nuclear days. But he also acknowledged the place of the martial virtues in a healthy character. We inherit the warlike type, he pointed out, and for most of the capacities of heroism that the human race is full of, we have to thank our bloody history. The martial virtues, he continued, although originally gained by the race through war, are absolute and permanent human goods. Militarism is the supreme theater of strenuousness, the great preserver of our ideals of hardihood. And human life, with no use for strenuousness and hardihood, would be contemptible. We pacifists, he wrote with characteristic intellectual generosity, ought to enter more deeply into the aesthetic and ethical point of view of our opponents. To militarists, a world without war is a sheep's paradise, flat and insipid. No scorn, no hardness, no valor anymore, he imagines them saying indignantly. Fie upon such a cattle yard of a planet. This, remember, was the era of Teddy Roosevelt, preacher of the strenuous life and instigator of splendid little wars. James's pacifism may be common sense to you and me, but when he wrote, the common sense of Americans was mostly on Roosevelt's side. How to nourish the martial virtues without war? James resolved this apparent dilemma with a suggestion many decades ahead of its time: universal national service. Every youth to be conscripted for several years of hard and socially necessary physical work, with no exceptions and no class or educational discrimination. This army without weapons would be the moral equivalent of war, breeding, James argued, some of the virtues essential to democracy. For example, intrepidity, contempt of softness, surrender of private interest, obedience to command. I am sure James would agree that these are not the only virtues essential to democracy. He himself, with his anti-imperialist activism, exemplified an equally essential skepticism and resistance to authority. But I wonder if our contemporaries, especially in the universities, who need no convincing about the necessity of skepticism and resistance to authority, would also agree with James about the importance of valor, strenuousness, and self-sacrifice. James wrote in America before World War I, a situation of almost idyllic innocence compared with that of the next writer I want to cite, D.H. Lawrence. The Great War, as contemporaries called it, was a soul-shattering experience for English writers. The complacent stupidity with which Europe's governing classes initiated, conducted, and concluded that war, the chauvinism and bloodlust with which ordinary people welcomed it, and above all, the mindless, mechanical grinding up of millions of lives by a war machine that seemed to go of itself. These things infuriated Lawrence almost to madness. Like many others, Lawrence saw the facelessness, the impersonality, the almost bureaucratic character of this mass violence as something new and horrifying in human history. But more than all others in the 20th century, Lawrence was the champion of the body and the instincts against the abstract, impersonal forces of modernity. Like Nietzsche, he marshaled torrents of impassioned prose against the apparently inexorable encroachments of progress. I am going to read a long and incandescent passage, which is either, I can't quite decide, quixotic nonsense or one of the greatest anti-war statements I know. It is from an essay called Education of the People, published posthumously in Lawrence's 2 volumes of Phoenix. We are all fighters. Let us fight. Has it come down to chasing a poor fox and kicking a leather ball? Heavens, what a spectacle we should be to the ancient Greek. Rouse the old male spirit again. The human male is a superb and godlike fighter, unless contravened in his own nature. What is the fight? It is a primary, physical thing. It is not a horrible, obscene, abstract business like our last war. It is not a ghastly and blasphemous translation of ideas into engines and men into cannon fodder. Away with such war, 1,000,000 times away with such obscenity. But let us keep the real war, the real fight, the sheer immediate conflict of physical men. What does death matter if a man die in the flame of passionate conflict? He goes to heaven, as the ancient said. Somehow, somewhere, his soul is at rest. Man must have the choice of war, but no bombs and poison gas. Let us blow all guns and explosives and poison gases sky high. Melt down all your guns of all sorts. But don't pretend you've abolished war. Send your soldiers to Ireland, if you must send them, armed with swords and shields, but with no engines of war. Trust the Irish to come out with swords and shields as well. They'll do it. And then have a rare old lively scrap, such as the heart can rejoice in. But in the name of human sanity, never point another cannon. In other words, my words now, fight when you must, when your blood boils over and your anger won't be gainsaid. But fight face to face, hand to hand, in your own quarrels and in your own skin, as a responsible human being and not a machine, or worse, a machine operator. I think William James would have agreed with that. I'll go further. I think Mary Wollstonecraft, Margaret Fuller, Dorothy Day, and Grace Paley would have agreed. I believe that one can be, must be, at the same time, a pacifist and feminist, and an upholder of the martial virtues. Exactly how, I leave to you as an exercise. Modernity imperils another set of virtues, which are a little harder to characterize than the martial virtues, but are even more important. I don't mean the bourgeois virtues, though there's some overlap. I suppose I'd call them the yeoman virtues, except that no one uses the word yeoman anymore, and hardly anyone even knows what it means. I have in mind the qualities of life we associate with the early American Republic. The positive qualities, of course, not the qualities that enabled slavery and genocide. In 1820, 80% of the American population was self-employed. Protestant Christianity, local self-government, and agrarian and artisanal producerism fostered a culture of self-control, self-reliance, integrity, diligence, and neighborliness. The American ethos that Tocqueville praised and that Lincoln argued was incompatible with large-scale slave owning. Today, that ethos survives only in political speeches and Hollywood movies. In a society based on precarious employment and feverish consumption, on debt, financial trickery, endless manipulation, and incessant distraction, such a sensibility seems archaic. According to the late Christopher Lasch, the advent of mass production and the new relations of authority it introduced in every sphere of social life wrought a fateful change in the prevailing American character structure. Psychological maturation, as Lasch, relying on Freud, explicated it, depended crucially on face-to-face relations, on a rhythm and a scale that industrialism disrupted. The result was a weakened, malleable self, more easily regimented than its pre-industrial forebear, less able to withstand conformist pressures and bureaucratic manipulation. the antithesis of the rugged individualism that had undergirded the Republican virtues. In an important recent book, The Age of Acquiescence, the historian Steve Fraser deploys a similar argument to explain why, in contrast with the first Gilded Age, when America was racked by furious anti-capitalist resistance, popular response in our time to the depredations of capitalism has been so feeble. Here is Fraser's thesis. During the first Gilded Age, the work ethic constituted the nuclear core of American cultural belief and practice. That era's emphasis on capital accumulation presumed frugality, saving, and delayed gratification, as well as disciplined, methodical labor. That ethos frowned on self-indulgence, was wary of debt, denounced wealth not transparently connected to useful, tangible outputs, and feared libidinal excess, whether that took the form of gambling, sumptuary displays, leisured indolence, or uninhibited sexuality. How at odds that all is with the moral and psychic economy of our own second Gilded Age. An economy kept aloft by finance and mass consumption has for a long time rested on an ethos of immediate gratification, enjoyed a love affair with debt, speculation, and risk, erased the distinction between productive labor and pursuits once upon a time judged parasitic, and become endlessly inventive about ways to supercharge with libido even the homeliest of household wares. Can these two diverging political economies, one resting on industry, the other on finance, and these two polarized sensibilities, one fearing God, the other living in an impromptu moment to moment, explain the great noise of the first Gilded Age and the great silence of the second? Is it possible that people still attached by custom and belief to ways of subsisting that had originated outside the orbit of capital accumulation were for that very reason, both psychologically and politically, more existentially desperate, more capable and more audacious in envisioning a non-capitalist future than those of us who have come of age knowing nothing else? If Fraser's argument is true, and I find it painfully plausible, where does that leave us? An individual's or a society's character structure cannot be willed into or out of existence. Lost virtues and solidarities cannot be regained overnight, or even, perhaps, in a generation. Even our ideologies of liberation may have to be rethought. A transvaluation of values may be in order. Faster, easier, and more may have to give way to slower, harder, and less, not only for ecological reasons, but also for reasons of mental and moral hygiene. And even if we bite that bullet and decide as a society to spit out the poisoned apple of consumerism and technological addiction, is there a path back? If individual self-sufficiency and local self-government are prerequisites for human flourishing, then perhaps it is too late. Here I must slip in a parenthesis. There is one book that, more than any other I know, takes the full measure of the dilemmas I've been hinting at, and nevertheless goes on to show one way to a sane and stable future. It's a utopian novel by Ernest Kallenbach called Ecotopia. It was published in 1975 and had a brief vogue, but seems to have disappeared along with the rest of the counterculture of that era. It deserves better. It's politically and psychologically astute, and ecologically far ahead of its or our time. But the utopian society it depicts, located in the Pacific Northwest, is made possible by the survival in that region of some of the very cultural traits and virtues whose obsolescence in the rest of the country I've been lamenting. Possibly some of those traits survive in this region too. They don't in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Do my apparently disparate sounding worries have anything in common? Possibly this: they all result from one or another move on the part of the culture away from the immediate, the instinctual, the face-to-face. We are embodied beings, gradually adapted over millions of years to thrive on a certain scale. Our metabolism's a delicate orchestration of innumerable biological and geophysical rhythms. The culture of modernity has thrust upon us, sometimes with traumatic abruptness, experiences, relationships, and powers for which we may not yet be ready, to which we may need more time to adapt. But time is short. All that is solid melts into air. Marx meant the crust of tradition dissolving in the acid bath of global capitalism. Now, however, the earth itself is indeed melting. Marx's great metaphor has acquired a terrifying second meaning. And so has Nietzsche's. If we cannot slow down and grow cautiously, evenly, gradually, into our new technological and political possibilities and responsibilities, even the potentially liberating ones, then the last recognizably individual men and women may give place, before too many more generations, to the simultaneously sub- and superhuman civilization of the hive. Thank you. The floor is yours. Yes.
Thank you first so much for your presentation. I really appreciate the slant of your work. So in terms of this sort of ethos, these values that you're sort of upholding, is there anyone in our culture contemporarily that you feel is a paragon of these virtues that we can look to, or is the nature of celebrity just sort of incompatible with the virtues that you're extolling?
Well, I don't know about someone whose own particular character embodies those virtues, but there is a writer, a social critic, who I think, to whom these arguments are indebted above all, and whose work makes a more comprehensive and persuasive and useful case than I have been able to in this or anything else I've written. I mean Christopher Lasch, the historian and political critic. I suppose the single book of his that's most useful is The True and Only Heaven. But The Culture of Narcissism and The Minimal Self are great works of theory, and his earlier books, The Agony of the American Left, The New Radicalism in America, and others are more directly political criticism, also exemplary. Then there's Ecotopia, which I think really does distill not just the environmentalist wisdom, or rather, Ernest Callenbach was probably more of an environmentalist than anything else, but he was also very smart about democratic political theory and just human psychology. And it's one path that I think we still might take. Anyway, no doubt I'll think of other writers and books as soon as we disperse. But yes,
I
Tony.
could follow up from his question. He asked for an individual, but are there countries, for example, like is it Finland, or are there societies, or at least microcosm societies that you know of that at least approach in the international current situation that we seem to aspire more successfully than we do?
Well, like most beleaguered American leftists, I have always looked with envy and longing across the ocean to Scandinavia. They have managed, perhaps because of ethnic homogeneity, to have combined technical progress with a close-knit society, a generous welfare state. I'm sure that if there is going to be a movement toward an ecologically sane and politically humane social order, that at least some of the first fruits of it will appear in those societies. There's a large complex of enterprises in Spain called Mondragon, which you probably know of. Mondragon, Mondragon. Spain has a tradition left over from the anarchist revolution of 1934 through 36 of working class radicalism, and it survived the long decades of Franco's reign, and there are a large, it's essentially a conglomerate, but it's owned by workers. Workers sit on the board and take all the important decisions. There are councils in each of the individual enterprises who make decisions about, shop floor decisions. There are places in the United States who are actually, I once heard a talk by Gar Alperovitz. Does that name ring a bell? He's an American historian and social critic, Gar Alperovitz. And
Could you speak up, please?
oh, Gar Alperovitz.
Thank you.
Has written a book about a book called After Capitalism, which lays out political strategies. In this particular talk, he was just back from the Midwest, where he'd been making a tour of cooperatively owned enterprises. And he made it sound as though there are an awful lot of people out there who don't need any convincing. They just need to network and to find resources, and that the ideas of economic democracy are in very inchoate form out there in the heartland. But, it's otherwise quite a dark time. I don't know what to point to as a hopeful or fruitful. Go ahead.
So you talked about the martial virtues being sort of cultivated through attending to the physicality of our embodiedness and our instinctual natures and that kind of thing. And I'm curious if that applies to other virtues as well, or just virtue in general. If you see abstractness as a sort of inherent problem with modernization, and getting out of our bodies as a problem that applies to more things than just martial virtues.
Well, I do. I think that industrialization was profoundly fateful because it put our relations of subsistence, our relations to our subsistence, on an abstract footing. Authority, both economic and political, educational, medical. Lasch makes this case about the bureaucratization of authority across every social sphere. It's the great, I think, contribution of his theorizing. And we have only imperfectly adapted to it. Lasch's idea was that infants need to that infants have a rich fantasy life. This was what he took from Freud. And that one of those fantasies is the response to an alternately gratifying and frustrating parent. And the response to the gratifying parent was a fantasy of union. The response to a frustrating parent was the fantasy of destruction, obliteration. And maturation, Lasch argued and Freud argued, is a gradual process of living down those fantasies, that those fantasies are essentially like superstitions. They produce in the infant psyche larger-than-life figures, both of the nurturing and the frustrating parent. And that those figures need to be whittled down to life size, and that happens over a period of years as the child sees the parents, in large part as it sees them at work, undergoing frustrations and defeats themselves. When the parent's work life is removed from the home, and when at least in more recent generations, childcare is also removed from the home, or is outsourced in some way. The child doesn't get a chance to whittle those fantasy figures, those outsized figures, down. Instead, the ultimate source of gratification and frustration, the ultimate authority, is removed. It's abstracted. That's what actually the word means in Latin, is abstrahere, means to remove. it's the company or the school system, etc. And so his argument is that these authority figures assume outsized proportions in the unconscious of those of us who've grown up in the industrial order. So it's in that sense that we need to, and I'm not sure how to respond, what to do with that criticism. I mean, I encountered Lasch 30 or 40 years ago and written about him quite a lot and talked about him quite a lot, and I don't know, and I think he died too young to figure out himself what to do about those criticisms. Yes, industrialism is the culprit, but can we really imagine life without it? And if not, how can we adapt it to our embodied natures? Any ideas? Yes.
I want to roll back to the first question, if I may. First of all, thank you for your very well-crafted remarks. I really appreciate them. But to offer some suggestions to you about exemplars in our society, think of a couple. Wendell Berry, Wes Jackson at the Land Institute in Kansas. And we have a few here in Missoula. Josh Slotnick, Neva Hassanen, who's on the faculty here, who I think embody these yeoman virtues, these virtues of capability and confidence in kind of revitalizing, if you will, the rural ideals that we came forward from. But what I'd like to offer is this kind of question about leadership, because I see so many students being hungry for the ability to exert these profoundly powerful ideas of exerting themselves and being successful and not being a conformist. But to organize is very difficult. And we have seen in our past these amazing organizations when we had FDR create the Civilian Conservation Corps, things that allowed people to embody these martial virtues and actually do good work, which we still benefit from. But we don't see that leadership today and say, here's the vision of how you can organize and do things. Do you have any examples of those people on either the political or the social stage that can rally people who have these desires?
Well, first, let me second your recommendation of Wendell Berry. He's a very wonderful writer. And what did you think of Bernie Sanders?
I wish he wasn't so old.
Yeah. It's true, and why isn't there a 64 and a 54 and a 44-year-old Bernie Sanders? That's right. Well, that's true. True enough. And what I think has happened to the Democratic Party in the last 30 years is best laid out in a book by Thomas Frank called Listen Liberal. He essentially says that we have a party of the 1%, the Republicans, and then we have a party of the 2 through 10%, and that's the Democrats. And quite convincing. Well, this book by Steve Fraser has a lot more besides that long passage that I read about analysis and strategy. I really don't know. The only hopeful sign for me is that under 35s went for Sanders in higher proportions than any other age bracket, and that about 40% of under 35s think that socialism might be worth a try, whatever they understand by socialism. Just something else. That's great. I mean, it is very hard to organize grassroots movements. The Tea Party did it. They had a lot of help at a critical point from the Koch brothers and other billionaire donors. There are one or two more left-wing billionaire prospective donors. As a matter of fact, parenthetically, there's a book by Ralph Nader, very different from his usual muckraking fare, called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, in which it's a kind of political fantasia, in which he imagines getting together 17 very wealthy or very famous people of left liberal persuasion, and imagines them creating a new movement. It's obviously he puts into their mouth all of the brilliant strategy. He puts into their mouth is nothing that George Soros or Warren Beatty would think of by themselves. But I mean, they might if they took on Ralph Nader as their executive director. But anyway, it's so there are some wealthy people who recognize just the inhumanity and irrationality of things as they are. But how to get to the point how to catch their eye, I don't know. The Tea Party was, well, you probably know more about it, having friends and neighbors involved than I do, but somehow irrational indignation seems to have a greater motive force than rational indignation. But we have no excuse for not trying. Yes?
So I loved your lecture, and I agree completely with your idea of remobilizing martial virtues as politics of resistance, and I'm reminded by a book by Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, where he diagnoses the condition of a capitalist subject in industrial society as a condition of repressive desublimation. And reading that work, I thought, okay, what do we do then to fight back against this monstrous system? And if you just negate and invert repressive desublimation, you get an aggressive sublimation, which is a militant dedication to values of duty and social solidarity. And I applied that very seriously. I'm involved in the Communist Party, student Occupy movements, Black Bloc, militant anti-fascist groups, Democratic Socialists of America, and I agree with you that that is something that can help, is giving up on personal happiness or the small little pleasures of the last man and actually fighting back for a greater cause. But my problem is kind of this strange condition where what Marx said about all that is solid melts into air, or the last man becoming something very literal because of the impending environmental catastrophes. is this strange condition where the reality that we are experiencing is so different from anything we've had before that these fantasias, these metaphors have become literalized by this abstract machine that we can't actually fight. And even when we do mobilize energy to resist, and even when we become more and more radical to fight back, or we moderate to try to pull people in, and you do have rational anger and rational arguments to get people to join, there's a tremendous amount of fear. Because people my age, despite maybe wanting universal health care, or wanting a socialist society, or wanting something different, have been raised in a sort of a liquid, eternal moment of the present, without the USSR, without anything to point to, despite how horrible it may have been in many respects, without anything to point to as something different. And so actually saying, let's change things, let's actually make politics not cultural, but an act of reallocating social resources is incredibly frightening to people. And even more than that, I think that there really is no way to mobilize people. And I've tried very hard and worked with many groups to do this, because the system is so large and so well integrated at this point, yet so faceless, so abstract, that there's nothing to hit. There's no small tweaks that you can make that can restore hope to people, because even if we did get something like universal health care, or raise taxes, or actually pass gun reform, we still have the environmental crisis, and we still have the wars in the Middle East. And so, I don't know, I think that you're right, but I also think that part of this is, alongside gaining martial virtues or learning how to fight, is being willing to lose, and to fight already in a position of defeat.
Yes, you can confidently expect many losses in the course of an activist career. Or yeah, things are. The ruling class is very well organized. I mean, the New Deal just annoyed the hell out of them, and they're just determined that's not going to happen again. And they've spent a lot of money co-opting intellectuals, getting control of, university budgets. Just the electoral system is, is very deeply distorted. By tightening public provision, by making work more precarious, they've just made everyone more justifiably scared. And selfish. Those are the attitudes that neoliberalism inculcates, and not by accident. It just makes coming together very difficult, more difficult than perhaps it was for our predecessors in the late 19th century or in the 1930s. But, you have to fight the fight that is handed to you. Yes?
You ended your seminar with talking about a superhuman, hive civilization. I was just wondering what you meant by that, but I was also wondering how... Sorry?
You said sub or super.
Sub or super, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering how us moving away from this kind of face-to-face civilization kind of contributes to that.
Well, I guess one place to look for insights into these possibilities is a very clever Netflix television series called Black Mirror. Mm-hmm. But I guess I mean that the space of for idiosyncrasy, for self-assertion, well, I think that possibly Facebook writ large is, I had in mind a civilization where just the presuppositions, the habits, the assumptions are homogeneous. Where everybody has I don't know, where everybody knows the latest viral rap song, where once people would come together who had been formed by very different books. I mean, a society where people were less transparent, where you could take less for granted about them, where you could be potentially transformed more frequently by a kind of relationship in depth, intellectual or ideological, is, I think it's different from where we're heading. I think, I mean, Hive is obviously a scary term, and it's obviously very far in the future, but I just meant it as a catchy phrase for a homogeneous culture.
I really appreciated your speaking about virtues, which we don't talk about them a lot, and I really like Aristotelian virtue ethics, so I was happy to hear that. And in Aristotle's conception of virtues, virtues are character traits that enable excellence, right? And so the whole mechanism of virtues is that when you display them, it brings about a certain kind of reward. And you talked about how the virtues in the 1820s, they were necessary for that kind of thing. So excellence looked differently then than it does now. And whether or not you want to say that there's a different kind of, or that there's a same excellence that we should be aiming towards, the societal vision of excellence looks different. So my question is, how can we encourage the cultivation of these virtues when perhaps they are not the character traits that are rewarded in today's society?
Well, the ideal person to answer that question is someone who spoke here not all that long ago, William Deresiewicz. The Marx famously said that in every age the ideas of the rulers are the ruling ideas. It's kind of a deduction from that in every age the education system is the system that produces the kinds of, participants that the ruling class wants, desires. You're going to have to do it on the fly. You're going to have to negotiate an educational system and an economic system that wants you to serve the bottom line, increase shareholder value, compete successfully, and at the same time, try and subvert it, not in any necessarily destructive way, but by talking to people about what's wrong with it, and maybe if you find such people, starting on a small or medium scale, enterprises or practices that call forth the kind of virtues that, there's no lever that one can move the whole world with. But yes, thinking about the job, about politics in terms of excellence and virtues, seems to me an excellent starting place. Yes? Hi.
I very much agree with the analyses that you invoked and apparently endorsed, and the conclusion to which you came, which is that democracy cannot be saved through mediocrity, but it requires a moral vision. And you spelled out the moral vision in terms of virtues. And with all that, agree, but I would like to offer two addenda. The first is virtues are moral skills, and every skill makes sense within a certain context and a certain tangible setting. A community, a plow, an angle, a bakery, and a horse, as in Benderberry and a plow. And if we don't talk about the context and the setting, virtue talk becomes abstract. Everybody nods. Who could be against it? But it has no purchase on the world. So I think there is hope where across the country people work with the objects that are the correlate of the virtues, or they work with their hands in breweries, bakeries, farm to table, the entire artisan culture that's coming up. And this is, I think, what needs recognition and support, political recognition and support. And it also connects with the specter of climate change, because you're doing something that you love to do and is good for climate change, or it easily can be. And so that sort of reality needs to be established within the technological culture, not as a replacement of many things, but not the infrastructure, for instance. And then my second addendum is, when you talk about Bernie Sanders, the moral vision gets lost. And the progressives usually can be understood as the people who want to spread mediocrity and make it safe for everybody. And there is such, I think, a reservoir of passion and energy among young people that they go to the next best thing. But I don't think Bernie Sanders is it. And because as I said, equality is understood in terms of the industrial culture. You know, everybody gets a house, a TV, a car, and so on. And so I really appreciate and I'm grateful for what you said, but I think these two addenda need to be kept in mind.
What could Sanders have added to his message that would have, that you think was lacking?
Pardon me?
What was lacking in Sanders' program and message? And
I think the first thing for Democrats is to get a majority, whatever it takes. And if Bernie Sanders had had a chance, I would have supported him. And the Democrats and a lot of people who are worried about democracy are looking around for a moral vision. And it's very difficult to locate in the current universe of political discourse. And it takes people like you and Wendell Berry and Christopher Lash to supply it, and then visionaries that promote the artisan culture to get support. But the first thing is, you know, in November, the Democrats have to win, and you have to be smart and realistic about what that takes. And Bernie Sanders didn't even hint, you know, at what lies beyond winning, and neither did Hillary Clinton, for that matter. Obama, in his books at least, and early in his presidency, sort of pointed at it, and so did Michelle Obama.
I accept your addenda. Well, thank you all very much.